Welcome. Today, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Critics warn that the proposed free trade agreement will bring job losses, lower wages, environmental degradation, tainted food, and undermine democracy. We'll get to that cheerful list in a moment. Also on today's program, what autism feels like on the inside. Then income inequality. Crunch the numbers and see the income divide growing in every ethnic and racial group in New York. Plus, in our public intellectual segment, where we look at new studies that can change our minds in public policy, a researcher finds she can track prescription drug abuse from the Twitterverse. Can she fight it there too? First, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement. It covers 11 countries from Chile to Vietnam. The Obama administration wants it passed early this year. But our guests say free trade hardly describes it. Corporate coup d'etat might be closer. Joining us via Skype from Washington, Lori Wallach, Director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and from Austin, former Texas Agricultural Commissioner, activist, and syndicated columnist, Jim Hightower. Thank you both so much for joining us. Hello from New York.
Good to be here.
Hello.
And Lori, let me turn to you first and ask you to tell us why, in your opinion, this would be such an outrage. I'm guessing for the large majority of our viewers, this is the first they're hearing of this entire topic.
Well, the TPP sort of sums up to NAFTA on steroids, spread out to 11 additional countries. The TPP has been negotiated since George W. Bush in 2008. It has 29 chapters, only 5 of them have to do with trade. The other 24 chapters would set binding constraints on Congress and state legislatures' ability to set policy on food safety, buy local and buy American procurement, financial regulation, trying to keep medicine prices down. It would limit internet freedom. It would even get into issues around climate, energy, basically rewriting wide swaths of U.S. domestic policy, rolling back progressive policies where they've been won, locking in backwards ones where they're still stewing, and doing all of it in a way that cannot be changed. Even if we had an election, the public decided they want a new policy, it would super glue all that retrograde corporate agenda into place. A lot of stuff that couldn't be done in the sunshine of Congress is being railroaded through these agreements. So a little piece of the Stop Online Piracy Act, SOPA's in the Copyright Act, a rollback of the Food Safety Modernization Acts and the food standards. There's some rollback of the Dodd-Frank financial regulation and the financial standards, et cetera, et cetera. And it's enforceable privately by the corporations themselves, private enforcement by corporations of a public treaty, by dragging the U.S. government to a private tribunal of 3 corporate attorneys who this agreement would empower to make the U.S. Treasury, order the U.S. Treasury to pay unlimited damages for undermining corporations' expected future profits with any government action or policy. Formalized corporate rule.
Other than that, it's a great idea. Jim
Bingo.
Hightower, want to pile on?
Well, sure. It's other than the little quibbles that Lori just ran through, it's a terrific deal. If you happen to be a major corporation, this has been negotiated, as Lori indicated, over many years. Yet we, the people, have not been privy to those negotiations. Indeed, members of Congress have not been privy to what's going on. They cannot even attend the negotiations. But there are 600 outsiders sitting around the table in these negotiations, and those are members of the industrial committees that were set up around it. So major corporations from A to Z, literally from AT&T to Zippo Manufacturing, are part of the negotiations, full-fledged, while we the people don't even know about it. We've been uninformed about it. And then we have the absurdity of recently the New York Times editorialized in favor of this trade scam that they had not even read. Sometimes you just, you don't know whether to weep or just go bowling, but they're bowling over us in this case.
Don't weep while you're trying to throw a bowling ball down the lane. That's my only advice. Why, Jim, would the New York Times editorialize for it? Why would President Obama, of all people, be for it? If it's as bad as you say? Maybe it's more nuanced than that.
Well, I long ago gave up trying to figure out why Obama does this or that. He seems to be very much wishy-washy when it comes to countering anything that corporations want. And this is number one on the corporate wish list because it is Christmas, it is Easter, it is Halloween, everything rolled into one for corporations because, as Laurie not only indicated in her comments, but has written brilliantly on in great detail. And I urge you to go to their website and get information on the details of this thing, that this is corporate rule imposed over the sovereignty of we the people. Just one little thing, and that's, Laurie mentioned it, but we have these laws, most cities and states do. We have them here in Austin, a Buy Austin project that we prefer to buy from local producers for our schools, for our city government, et cetera. We have Buy Green, we have Buy Sweatshop Free, we have Buy this or that. That's the prerogative of sovereign people to decide how our tax dollars are spent. Under the TPP, our cities would not be allowed to do that.
Laurie, tell me more about that. You're a Harvard lawyer. The list that you gave at the outset, and Jim was just going into a little bit more of the details on some of those things, included so many ways that U.S. sovereignty would be breached. But how could this trade agreement with Pacific-facing countries do that on top of U.S. law, on top of urban law, on top of other things that we depend on to protect us?
The binding obligation in this agreement, and unfortunately in agreements like NAFTA and WTO, is, quote unquote, each country shall ensure the conformity of its domestic laws, regulations, and administrative procedures with the attached agreements. We're required to take our old laws and update them to meet these constraints, and our future laws have to be limited to those terms. And if we fail to do so, both another country in the agreement can drag us to a foreign tribunal and impose trade sanctions until we roll back our laws, or the private corporation, through the so-called investor state enforcement system, can privately drag us to a foreign tribunal and, as I said, extract cash damages for any domestic policy that violates the trade agreement rules that undermines their expected future profits.
What's your take on the Obama question? And one possible theory that I'll just throw out there is that he's trying to shift the focus of U.S. foreign policy in general to Asia, because he thinks that's where maybe not military threats like pertinent to al-Qaeda and things like that, but the economic power base of the future is going to lie, and that maybe this is one of the attempts of the Obama administration to get as strong a foothold as they can in the Pacific Rim. So that's just one theory. What do you think of it, and why else would President Obama, of all people, before this list of horribles that you laid out?
Well, certainly it is part of their so-called Pacific pivot, but it's one thing to think about what the foreign policy of the U.S. should be with respect to Asia. It's another thing to organize a corporate takeover of Asia on behalf of U.S. corporations that also is taking over even what's left of our democracy. I mean, there's no problem with having agreements with Pacific-facing countries. The question is, what are the rules? And this is just a slow-motion coup d'etat. I mean, this agreement's like some Trojan horse, to mix a metaphor, that's painted up to be a trade agreement, and that's what they branded it. But inside really is this whole other agenda. And why? You know, unfortunately, Obama basically got the band back together. That would be the NAFTA band. He took all these folks who during NAFTA were in the White House, and he brought them back. A bunch of them rotated through Wall Street or other corporate interests during the period that George W. Bush was in office. But now, as a result, you got these guys running the gig. It's like that movie Groundhog Day. I fought these guys during NAFTA. 20 years of NAFTA's passed. The U.S. has net lost 1 million jobs to unbalanced trade with Mexico and Canada. U.S. real wages during that period have declined, so we're now at 1979 levels. We have washed out millions of high-wage manufacturing jobs, and folks have seen replacement of those jobs with jobs in the service sector that pay, according to the Department of Labor, on average 20% less. NAFTA has been one of the biggest, and the WTO, big contributors to income inequality. Story yesterday in the Washington Post, one of the pro-NAFTA think tanks says 39% of the growth in income inequality can be attributed to our trade policy. So with all of that, you're thinking, wait a minute, isn't that the opposite of what Mr. Obama's talking about? But you got all these guys in the White House, be it cognitive dissonance, they don't want to be responsible for the damage NAFTA did, so let's expand it. TPP, or they're just true believers because of where they were brung up, which is to say professionally, like the folks they hang out with are the handful of corporate interests, the Wall Street guys, et cetera, are going to benefit, and they're just foisting the same old agenda. But the good news is the proxy for this whole TPP vote is Obama can't get this thing through Congress on its own. It's not like a skunk at a picnic. It's like a whole picnic of skunks. So there are enough Democrats and Republicans who've said basta that he's trying to get this thing called fast track trade authority. It's like some legislative luge run. It would force TPP railroad style right over Congress without the normal review, no amendments, guaranteed up or down vote in 60 days.
And on those points, Jim Hightower, on those last points that Laurie was making, my understanding is that the details of this trade agreement weren't even released to the public. They were leaked to the public. Otherwise, there was no mechanism for even us to know about it before it would be signed, sealed, and delivered. Is that your understanding?
Yes, we still don't really see it all, and the part we do see was released through groups like the Citizen Trade Watch and WikiLeaks now, putting these documents out finally for us to get a little peek at them. But that's good. That's their problem because Lyndon Johnson once said you can't make chicken salad out of chicken manure. And that's all they've got in this thing, is chicken manure. And the more the people see...
Thank you for cleaning that one up for television.
Thank you. I did my part there, didn't I? The more the people see of this, the more bigger whiff they get of it, then the stinkier it is going to be, and the harder impossibility, really, for them to pass this thing. The people don't want what is being proposed in here. They will be outraged by it. This could be at a time when you've got everybody from Occupy Wall Street to the mayor of New York to the Pope talking about inequality. Here is something that drastically exacerbates the inequality in our country and around the world.
So Jim Hightower, on that, past free trade agreements since the original rounds of NAFTA and GATT, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, have started to include some kinds of protections for labor and the environment to prevent at least some of the race to the bottom in each thing for country after country. I think Democrats and progressives got their message out on that enough that it started to be part of free trade agreements. Do you agree that they've been in there and some of the others? And does this one break a pattern of trying to do something to protect labor rights?
Practically none. Laurie can speak to one we did do well, but generally speaking, no. And this one, we just learned today, I guess it was, in a story that indicated that the one thing that is good in it, some provisions involving environmental regulations around the world, the Obama administration is now going to surrender, saying, well, we can't get that through, so we'll just go with the rest of it. Well, the rest of it is against we the people. It's against labor. It's against it exacerbates the inequality around the world, and now they're taking out one good little element that is in there. So no, this is not worth. And that's why, by the way, we're going to have it's not just liberal Democrats, it's not just labor that are going to vote against this thing in the Congress, but it's also a good number of Tea Party, right-wing Republicans are against it as well. Some of them because they don't want Obama to win anything, but others because they see that this is a direct invasion of the sovereignty of we the people.
Laurie, that's an interesting coalition for you in Washington there to potentially work with, huh?
That's why I was going with the fast track. So the fast track is this procedure, and already in the last year, you had 151 Democrats say no, another 10 Democrats say probably no, and 30 Republicans say no way, no how, not constitutional. So you add those up, and already you're basically at 190 votes in the House of Representatives, which is where this fight is happening. The TPP fight is happening in the context of fast track. The question is, will Congress maintain its authority to try and force the terms of TPP to be changed, or is it going to handcuff itself and just let it zoom through?
And is that the constitutional question? Because the Constitution gives the Senate the right to approve treaties. Is that the constitutional issue?
No. This isn't a treaty. This is an international executive agreement. Fast track, as I was trying to explain, is a procedure that sets up votes, simple majority in the House and the Senate. This is not a treaty. There is no supermajority Senate vote. These are simple majority votes. And if anyone is worried about TPP and they want to do something about it, They need to make sure there isn't fast-track procedure, which would railroad the agreement through the House and the Senate. The place where the opposition is possible is the House. Between conservative Republicans and most of the Democrats, there is a majority to be built. To make TPP have to be fully debated and taken apart in Congress, to actually be overlooked carefully. And if that were the case, like Jim said, it's like a whole bunch of smelly fish.
Jim, on the politics of this, before you go, why do the Democrats get behind it if it's going to come back and bite them, which I think we've seen historically for 20 years now, support for NAFTA and other such agreements has?
Follow the money. This is about the Citizen United decision edict by the Supreme Court. This is about appeasing the corporate contributors to both political parties, but the Democrats want that money as well. And this is, again, the #1 on the wish list of corporate America. So they are calling in all of their chits saying, we want this. Now, when you say Democrats, you're essentially talking about the White House and the Robert Rubin Wall Street crowd that Clinton had in to pass NAFTA, and now their heirs that come from the same bunch that Obama has brought in. But I think the Democrats in the Congress and in the Senate and elsewhere are full scale. You've got people like Elizabeth Warren, you've got Sherrod Brown, you've got Bernie Sanders, you've got folks in the Senate there who are not going to roll over for Obama on this one.
Viewers, now you know at least that this exists and that the Obama administration wants this vote in Congress early this year. Go find out more, take your stance, contact your representatives if you have a strong feeling. Jim Hightower, Lori Wallach, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Coming up next, tweets tell a tale of prescription drug abuse. Now it's time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. Prescription drug abuse and misuse have become leading concerns in the public health field. In the U.S., the sale of these, quote, legal drugs has more than tripled in the last decade, and so have rates of abuse. In fact, prescription painkillers sent 2.5 million people to the emergency room in 2011, according to the Centers for Disease Control. So now, researchers are turning to a new source to shed light on the topic, social media, to study attitudes and perceptions of these drugs. A new study from the University of Pennsylvania shows that when thousands of tweets about prescription painkillers are sampled, more tweets show signs of prescription drug abuse than of therapeutic use. But does this mean Twitter might also be used to change attitudes and fight the epidemic? Dr. Jean-Marie Perrone, professor of emergency medicine, is lead author of the study. She joins us via Skype from Philadelphia. Thank you for coming on. Hello from New York.
Hi, it's my pleasure. I really thank you for the opportunity to get the word out about this big problem that we have.
What led you to turn to tweets to study prescription drug abuse in the first place?
I do have to give credit to Dr. Raina Merchant, who is a colleague of mine at Penn, who is the director of the social media lab, the newly created social media lab at the Center of Innovation at Penn. She had done a similar study studying cardiac arrest, so she had kind of some of the idea for the study.
So in 1 week, you analyzed thousands of individual tweets and put them in categories. How do you do that? How does a handful of researchers do that?
So what we did was you can put this into Twitter yourself. You can search Twitter by keywords. And so we used some of the most common keywords that we could find in tweets, words like Percocet, Vicodin, Perks, and Hydro. So we used both street terms and general terms for drugs. And you can assemble a list of tweets with those keywords. So we actually followed those keywords for a week and downloaded all of the tweets that contained those keywords. We actually looked at 6 keywords.
And so there were 2 main findings, as I understand it. One about abuse versus therapeutic use and the references that relate to each, and the other about positive feelings versus negative feelings. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, one of the things we were trying to do was to get the public sentiment about these drugs and determine whether or not people had any idea that they might be dangerous. And you can interview people who are being admitted to drug treatment centers about their feelings, but they have already a different sense. So this is kind of a way to see the public dialogue in real time. And the finding that we had was probably similar to what we expected, which was there was a lot of talk about the drugs being abused. And not surprisingly, people really like these drugs. So a lot of the sentiment about the drug use was very positive.
And did those two things cross categories? In other words, did people who are having drug abuse problems also refer to these drugs positively, or did the positive references tend to come from the people who are actually using them as painkillers therapeutically?
It's interesting. There's a little bit of both. If you look at those two categories as plus and minus, there was also a category of people who were using it for therapeutic use. For example, they got a prescription for Percocet as a post-operative pain reliever, and then they had nausea and vomiting. So we would characterize that as a negative experience and not abuse. So therapeutic use, negative. So there are almost 4 outcomes that we could look for. There was a 5th outcome, which was uncharacterizable. And that was just somebody would say, I got to get more Percocet. And it was hard for us to interpret if that meant because they were prescribed it and they had run out, or if they were using it as abuse. So we tried to be generous and err on the side of therapeutic use rather than abuse, because we didn't want the study to be biased towards finding abuse.
We have some sample tweets that we're going to put up on the screen. Let's get the first one up. And this says, what you know about them oxys. Now, you categorize this as uncharacterizable. Can't tell whether this relates to abuse or therapeutic use. And similarly with the context. So that's an example of what you were just talking about. What you know about them oxys. Can't tell whether that's good or bad or about abuse or not. Here's another one. Every time I come to emergency, they give me super hard Percocet. I just want a warm blanket, LOL. Again, you can't tell if this relates to abuse or not, but the context is negative. It seems like the person is finding the Percocet to be too hard for them. Their word, hard. Here's another one, very different. Never thought about the don't mix alcohol and Vicodin until they were already in my system doing their thing. Panic mode since ceased, bed. So obviously this was a negative reference, but you characterize it as abuse. I'm not sure I could tell whether that was from abuse or somebody getting over pain who also happened to have some drinks.
Right. So I think that we're not supposed to mix them with alcohol. So we think that that might highlight abuse characteristic. But there was also crossover when people were interpreting that. So we actually had a 20% overlap between investigators in terms of whether or not we agreed on whether or not it was abuse or therapeutic use. So we did try and cross-check ourselves for some validity. This was qualitative research, so it was subject to, interpretation. There was no yes, no, right, wrong.
Yeah. Is it quantitative research in the sense that you were counting the number of references that seem to go with abuse compared to the number of references that seem to go with medical use, and the fact that you found so many pertaining to abuse seems to indicate that as many or more people may be using these things to get high as are using it medicinally, or wouldn't you want to start to draw that conclusion or inference?
Well, of course, we have, someone would say quickly a bias sample, because not everyone who got a prescription, would be on Twitter. So there might be a demographic that leans more towards younger people. So really, we couldn't make that kind of conclusion. Additionally, there was some concern amongst the authors, especially the more statistically oriented ones, that we can't make our qualitative study into something quantitative. So really, the gestalt was that it was more about abuse and that it was generally more positive than would be indicated. But that positive was also associated with therapeutic use. So in either category, there was a lot of positive, which goes along with the whole problem with these drugs, which is people like them.
As a matter of research methodology in general, what do you get from doing a qualitative study? I think people are so used to hearing about studies in terms of the numbers they turn up. So if numbers are not the goal, what do you get from doing what you call a qualitative study?
So it is more descriptive of our experience, what we found and what we observed. I think it can be applied in situations where you don't have a lot of numbers and that you're really, going into a new area. Twitter per se has not really been used for this kind of application, and really there's very few. Before we did our study, there were very few published papers in PubMed about Twitter. So there's been literally just a handful. So we really thought we were just going to be able to describe themes. And then when we came up with the numbers, it gave us a little more of a chance to, I guess, almost give people something that they can grab onto numerically to summarize the results. But we thought we would find themes related to emergency departments and going to the dentist for Percocet, that kind of thing.
Let's put up a couple of more graphics that give us interesting information from your findings. And this one is labeled Tweets Suggesting Prescription Opioid Abuse. And so what we're looking at here is which drugs got mentioned the most often with respect to abuse. And you see the big spike there is just the general term oxys, which relates to the one to that bar's left, which is OxyContin, and some others in that category. Percs got mentioned a lot, and to its left, the more specific Percocet, and then over on the right, Vicodin a fair amount, and Hydros at the bottom. So oxys used in general street slang as a general category, including OxyContin and other things?
Well, so we use those keywords to comb Twitter for people talking about it. So you would expect, obviously, I think that oxy would be more of a term associated with abuse than OxyContin. And we sort of found that. We didn't exactly find it across the board, but Percs had a higher abuse ratio than Percocet, since people describe Percocet sometimes more in therapeutic settings. If that makes sense. So it was really the keywords that we were actually sorting Twitter by.
Right. And of course, anybody who can express a 12-letter word as a 4-letter word is going to do it on Twitter. I think we have one more graphic here to put up that relates to this with respect to which drugs were mentioned positively. And so we see Hydros at the top this time. That was very low on the other one. Vicodin second to highest, and then oxys. Why the difference? And for people who don't know the word Hydros, what does that relate to?
So hydro relates to hydrocodone, and hydrocodone is the #1 most prescribed drug in the United States. There's 130 million prescriptions for hydrocodone.
Whoa.
More than blood pressure medicine, more than antibiotics. So you would expect it as a popular term to show up the most. I think it might just reflect volume of prescriptions. Vicodin also is another hydrocodone containing product, a name brand hydrocodone product. So it is really just prescribed a lot more often than oxycodone or OxyContin or Percocet, which are all oxycodone containing drugs, which are also prescribed a lot, but not nearly the magnitude of hydrocodone, which, as I said, is really the most popular drug in the country right now.
So do you think that Twitter or other social media could be used to fight prescription drug abuse, or could you only use it in the way you did to measure anecdotally and to some degree statistically what's out there?
I think it can. I think it can definitely, be used for targeted education. People and organizations like the CDC, I follow Tom Frieden, who's the director of the CDC, on Twitter, and so he tweets about the flu epidemic right now, and he might be tweeting about prescription drugs. And so there could be opportunities for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Organization, the CDC, CVS pharmacies to put out public information to people who, would follow them, looking for public health tips. And perhaps as a parent or a physician, you may actually gain a little bit of insight as someone on Twitter with those kinds of tips from people like that.
Dr. Perrone, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
During the recent mayoral campaign, inequality was, of course, the watchword. But in terms of household income, exactly how unequal are New Yorkers? and how much has wealth concentrated over the last couple of decades? The Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies at CUNY has just published a study on this, broken down by race, ethnic group, and Latino nationalities. The data show an extraordinary and growing concentration of wealth, not just in the city at large, but within each major race and ethnic group. Quantitative Research Associate Justine Calcagno crunched the numbers. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
And I want to go right to the first graphic that comes from your data, because we're going to look at some really interesting charts here. And this is median household income earned by the upper 1%, 10%, and 20% of households over time. So viewers, you'll see the leftmost set of bars represents 1990, the middle one 2000, the one to the right 2010, or no, I'm sorry, it's the upper 1% on the left, the upper 5% in the middle, the upper 10%, top 10% on the right. But what we see is that they're all changing in the same direction over the decades, right? Mm-hmm. What are we seeing here?
Well, so we're seeing exactly what you opened with, which is that there's this enormous and growing concentration of wealth among the upper earners in New York City. So essentially, the idea is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are treading water, the poor are remaining stagnant. And this particular figure really demonstrates the first statement, which is that the rich are getting richer.
So, for example, if we can put that back up for a second, people making in the top 1% of incomes in 1990 were making about $450,000 a year. Right. Today, in order to get to the top 1%, you have to be making over $700,000
right. And that's
a year.
An extraordinary difference, $250,000. And even if you look at the upper 10%, you're looking at about $60,000 over the course of 20 years, which is really interesting, but it's even more meaningful if we look at it in the comparative context.
And let's do that by putting up the next slide, and we will see, by comparison, the lowest 10% of earners over time and the lowest 20% of earners to the right over time. And I guess what's striking about these bars compared to the ones we just saw is that they don't change very much.
They haven't changed hardly at all. We're talking $1,000 really across 20 years. So we're talking $1,000 versus hundreds of $1,000s among the upper earners.
So the poorest 10% of earners made about $8,000 a year in 1990, only about $9,000 a year in 2010. And I guess that's in adjusted dollars.
Yeah, all the dollars are in 2012 dollars.
So it shows that the rich are getting richer and the poor are hanging out where they were.
Yep.
Which means that there are more dollars to go around, actually. There must be more wealth, because if this group is staying at the same average income as they were, and the other group is making all this extra money, there is all this extra money, but it's only going to the top.
Right. Yes, it's going directly to the top. And if we look at maybe the next figure, we can really see the control of that wealth going to the upper earners.
Okay, and so this is the percentage of total household income earned by the top 1% on the left, those in the top 5% in the second one, those in the top 10% and those in the top 20%?
Right, yeah, and so what you can see here is that the upper earners, the people in these upper earning categories are, as you've kind of said, snatching up the wealth, right? What's happening here is if you look to the right, the upper 20%, for instance, have increased from 47% controlling the control of wealth to 53%. And
in other words, of all the wealth in the city, if you make in the top 20%, in 1990, the red bar, the top 20% controlled 47% of all the wealth. Now it's 53%.
Right. And that's just an enormous number by itself. If you think about it, if this is the pie of wealth in New York City, this is 50% of the pie, and 50% is going to the upper 20% of people. And that's an extraordinary indicator of economic inequality presently in 2010.
And by comparison, we'll put up the next chart, and we're seeing the percentage of total household income earned by the lowest 10% on the left, 20% in the middle, and 40%, which is such a huge percentage of the population,
Right.
over on the right.
Right. Yeah, and what you'll see is that their control of the wealth is small, and it's also stagnant across these 20 years. And in the case of the lower 40%, when you look at all of those people, it's declining. It's gone from 12% to 10%. So as of 2010, the lower 40% have 10% of the wealth.
And again, I want to emphasize how big a number that is. We're talking about 40% of the population of New York City are controlling only 10% of the wealth in New York City.
Right, so 10% of that pie, essentially. Yeah, and if you look at the bottom 10%, they're controlling less than 1% of the wealth on the far left of that figure.
Right, and you would think that the poorest people would control the least wealth.
Right.
But I guess
Still
it's a question
extraordinary.
of distribution and how much they have.
Right.
Let's go to the next chart, and this one is the percentage of total households and income by race and ethnicity. So now we start to compare, and if this print is too small for you to see it on your screen, it's non-Hispanic whites on the left, Latinos second to the left, then non-Hispanic blacks and Asians to the right. And this is comparing what? The red bars and the blue bars?
So the red bars are showing you that what percent of the total households do these groups make up. The blue bars are showing what percent of the income do they control. And so what this figure itself shows is the kind of racial disparities that you might expect.
So 37% of the city is white, looking at the leftmost pair of bars. 37% of the city is white, but those folks have 50% of the income.
Right, exactly. And if you look at, let's say, Latinos and non-Hispanic blacks, you see the patterns reverse, where Latinos are about a quarter of the households in New York, but they only control 18% of the wealth. Similar pattern among non-Hispanic blacks, and among Asians, this is the only group you see that they control the same amount of income as they make up percentages of households.
The Goldilocks group. It's just about right. If you're 13% of the population and you're getting 13% of the income, we wish it was that even across the board.
I would hope so, yes.
Next slide. This is the median household income earned by the upper 1% of households in the city. And so we're looking at that by each race, right?
So this is the upper 10% that you have up here.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Sorry, what does
So
it
go ahead.
show?
Yep.
Right, so it's showing a similar thing that we were just talking about, the kinds of racial disparities that you might expect to see, where non-Hispanic whites, at least in the upper 10% of households, have much higher median incomes than the other three major racial groups in New York City.
I see. So if you're in the upper 1%,
Upper 10.
10%, did it again. If you're in the upper 10% of white earners in New York, then you're making $428,000 a year. If you're in the upper 10%, the top 10% of Latinos, the yellow bar to the right, then you're only making $173,000
Right.
a year.
Non-Hispanic whites are making more than twice as much in median income as Latinos.
So each group tops out at a different place
Right.
as well.
Definitely, yes.
All right, next graph. What's this?
So this figure is the median household income that's being earned among the upper percentiles, upper 1, 10, and 20% among the non-Hispanic white population. And so I think we're showing this because a really important point to talk about within this data, and you mentioned at the beginning, is it's not just that economic inequality is increasing across New York City as a whole. It is, but it's also increasing within every major racial group. And by that I mean that rich non-Hispanic whites are getting richer and rich Latinos are getting richer. And we see this within non-Hispanic blacks and Asians as well. So this figure should look a lot similar to the opening figure about the total population, where, let's say, the upper 1% have increased quite dramatically over the last 20 years.
So we're running out of time, but this has been really instructive, and I think laying it out visually like that lets a lot of people who may not have thought so specifically about what income inequality means in New York City, even though people know it's out there, let people have a better sense of that. Do you make policy recommendations?
Do I personally? There are policy recommendations out there in the political ether, recommendations for decreasing this kind of
Sure. I mean, the first thing that Mayor de Blasio is talking about is pre-K.
Right, is education. Education is a huge gateway to economic success. They're very, very correlated. So that's definitely one way in which we might decrease economic inequality. There's also, you hear quite often, the asking the rich to pay a little bit more, so addressing the tax code is one way. Another way is to increase resources to the lower earners in terms of affordable housing and affordable health care to sort of lighten the burden among those households so that they can have some capital with which to make investments in financially or in terms of education.
Although the numbers that we saw today had so much to do with how much people earn, that something would need to be done, it seems, and I'm sure it's highly complex, to get jobs that pay better to more people in the city.
It is very complex. I think that it's and unfortunately in some ways glacial, it's generational. So pre-K, it's about making sure that access to quality education is there for the younger generations, and that's how you're going to get people into the workforce in well-paying jobs. But in terms of just, the minimum wage hasn't increased much in the last, decades, and so increasing that could be one way to also address the income inequality for the very low earners.
Well, thanks for sharing all this data with us. Autism. It's a subject many of us are only familiar with from oversimplified representations in the movies or on the news. The jarring image of an emotionally distant child inflicting pain on himself or others stands out in our common belief. But for those with autistic family members and a deeper relationship to the disorder, the picture is more nuanced, with many questions left unanswered. However, there are some new insights from one man's unique understanding of his own son's behavior that one day might even lead to more effective treatment. Here to tell us his story and share her own experience is Time Magazine neuroscience journalist Maya Salovitz. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start all the way at the beginning because there are so many misconceptions.
Yes.
What is autism?
So autism is a disease that's characterized by several things. One is repetitive behavior. The other is sensory disturbances. Another aspect is social and communication issues. And that's basically all of it.
And it's a relatively new disease in terms of our understanding because there was no such thing clinically until, what, the 1940s?
Yes, it was first discovered, so to speak, in the 40s.
What do the terms refrigerator mother and theory of mind mean? Are these your terms?
These are not my terms, absolutely not. But refrigerator mother is an unfortunate historical term because in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people believed that autism was caused by cold, distant, rejecting mothers, and that these children were basically suffering from severe neglect. Now, that is absolutely not the case. But what is the case is that children who have been severely abused and neglected sometimes look autistic. But autistic children, autism is absolutely not caused by that.
So do the public and the scientific community understand autism differently?
It's been a long journey. It's certainly moved away from the refrigerator mother and all the parent blaming stuff. But then it sort of moved into, and this is where the term theory of mind comes from, it moved into this idea that autistic people lack empathy. And the problem there is that empathy is a complicated word and phenomenon. There's two types of empathy. There's empathy that is cognitive, which is that I know that you have a different mind and you know different things than I do. And then there's emotional empathy, which is I care about how you feel. And with autism, the issue is delayed development of cognitive empathy. So basically, you might not understand that other people see the world differently than you do. And this will obviously affect your social behavior. But once you do understand that other people see the world differently, you actually have no problem feeling emotions and no problem with your own emotions. In fact, you may be overwhelmed by your own emotions. But the public has come to this idea that autistic people are cold, they are distant, they don't care at all. And there's been a confusion with autism and sociopathy. You might say that autistic people care, but they don't know. But sociopaths know, but they don't care. So sociopaths are actually very good at manipulating people, and they know very well how you think. In fact, they want to use that against you. They don't care how you feel.
So let's get to Henry Markram.
Yes, so Henry Markram is a fascinating scientist. He heads the European Human Brain Project, which has $1 billion budget to do a simulation of the human brain on a supercomputer. And lots of people have written about that project, but why I was interested in him was that he has an autistic son, and he and his second wife, Camilla, she's an autism researcher, and so their theory about autism really appealed to me because it was not about this autistic people lack empathy. It was about how autistic people experience the world very differently.
This is the intense world theory?
Yes, and the idea is basically that the world is kind of like having these spotlights that are on me now, or having, imagine being at a rock concert, death metal or some other genre that you don't happen to like, blasting, and you're a baby and you're trying to learn language. If you were in that situation, and imagine further that all your clothes felt incredibly itchy and there were bright lights flashing all over the place, it would be pretty hard to pick up language. It would be even harder to pick up social cues. And this is what the world feels like for a lot of autistic people.
Is this a new theory? Because I feel like this has been at least part of my understanding of autism for a good number of years.
It is new in that it has been slow to be accepted by the research community, because a lot of the research has still been focused on social deficits and on lack of empathy and on, you know, what's going on with cognitive empathy. In fact, it was autistic people themselves that in the latest edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual insisted that sensory issues be included. So while people who have been interested in autism have known about the sensory difficulties for a long time, they have not been connected or put at the core of the disorder until the Markrams and some other researchers have begun to do that.
And yet, it always seems like when people are talking about autistic children or autistic anybody, they're talking about people who have a hard time being touched.
Yes.
So you would think that, and again, not to overgeneralize, but that's there frequently.
Yes.
So you would think that it would be top of mind to consider sensory overload or a more intense sensory experience of the world.
You would think that, but if you look at the very early writings on autism, they describe exactly that, and then they say that these children are rejecting their parents. These children are being defiant. These children are trying to live in their own little world. So the children were blamed, the parents were blamed. It was never looking at the world from the autistic perspective, and it's only since we've had people like Temple Grandin and other autistic people who've actually spoken out about what the world is like for them that we have begun to have the science moving more towards looking at it that way. And when you have the science actually understanding the subjective experience of the people they're studying, it's a lot better.
Tell me more about what Henry Markram learned from his son and how.
Well, so his son has quite severe autism, and he was, you know, sort of running around doing very dangerous things, like he went and patted a cobra on the head, you know, running into traffic, all of this kind of stuff. And he, you know, didn't understand what was going on. And he, you know, sort of dove into the autism research, which he was, you know, a very basic neuroscientist. He wasn't looking at anything clinical. So he began looking at the work, and he discovered this model that existed in rats called the VPA rat. And basically what happens in this rat is that if you give the epilepsy drug valproate to a pregnant rat, the baby will have quite autistic symptoms.
Huh.
And that baby rat will have everything from lowered sensitivity to pain, which human autistic people also have, to increased sensory intensity, and also they learn faster and they have more fear. And so when he saw that in the rat, he started to look at his son's behavior differently, and he started to see, wait a minute, like when he's having these meltdowns and freaking out, it's probably a sensory thing. And so when he began to see that, he also began to see that his son's characteristics were kind of a exaggeration of some of his own traits. And that the thing that makes him a really good scientist, that he can visualize incredibly, imagine if that was amped up to 10, you might not be able to deal with the world. And so it brought him a lot closer to his son.
It's an interesting contradiction, too, isn't it? Lack of sensitivity to pain,
Yes.
and yet this feeling of sensory overload from normal stimulus.
Yes, yes. And I don't think we really understand that yet, but it definitely seems to be a common, characteristic. The thing about autism that is complicated, like many other diseases that affect the brain, is that if the saying is, if you've seen one person with autism, you've seen one person with autism. If you're describing a condition based on its behavior, which is all we can do with mental conditions these days, it's very, it's obviously there's going to be 20 different ways to get there.
You often write about addiction.
Yes.
Why are you writing about autism, and is there a connection?
Well, in me, there probably is a connection. This is probably a very unusual path to addiction. I don't think there is any data linking this, but I certainly know that when I was a child, I had the classic Asperger's, did not want to be touched, lights were too bright, sounds were too loud. I was like the little professor, always lecturing people. I was, gifted, and I was very, very intense emotionally. But the diagnosis didn't exist then, and also being a girl, people don't often think about that diagnosis.
More boys have Asperger's or autism.
And I mean, there's an interesting theory that suggests that maybe anorexia is a manifestation of autism in girls, where the obsession just gets focused on food. But girls aren't usually obsessed with trains, for example. But I had very many obsessions, and when I started to become a teenager, I was really, really desperate for social contact because I wasn't this. I was over-empathizing, and that was making me unable to deal, basically. I would take things very literally. I would, I just had all the classic stuff. So when I discovered drugs, it was like, aha, now I have a way to connect with people. And now I have an obsession that people are actually interested in. If I go on about opera or science fiction, I'm going to be a geek. If I go on about drugs, people are going to want to talk to me. And so, so that sort of really did drive my addiction. And, for me also, the sensory overload, opiates are very good at managing sensory overload. And that's probably why I loved heroin so much. So obviously that was not the best way to medicate this situation, but, that was in my story.
But seeing that connection,
yes,
at least having a theory about that connection from your own experience, is something you're putting out there because maybe it'll help science understand, maybe it'll help families.
Absolutely, and I think that, that saying about if you've seen one person with autism is even more true if you've seen one person with addiction, because there are so many different ways. Some people with addiction are undersensitive, and that actually happens to some extent in autism as well, but you've got people with depression, you've got people who get into addiction via poverty and unemployment, and it's a complex thing because it can be a way of seeking meaning, and it's also obviously a disorder. So it becomes very, very complex very quickly.
Last question. At the end of your article, you suggest that this intense world theory could have implications for treatment and for helping families. How so?
Yes, well, I think that once you understand that your kid is withdrawing from your touch, not because they're rejecting you, but because they are oversensitive, the relationship automatically becomes better. Once you can see the world from their perspective, in fact, lack of empathy for people with autism has been a big part of the problem. Once you can see that, then you can connect much better. And also you can mitigate things. I mean, if you know that every time the kid goes to a supermarket, they're going to have a meltdown because of the lights, well, you don't take them to the supermarket, or you give them a way to hide their face, or if it's sounds, you give them headphones. There are just ways to manage this. And I think one of the fascinating things is if you can manage this really, really early, before the kid is missing some of that social input that's critical and that language input that's critical in the first 3 years, you might be able to actually keep the talents and mitigate the handicap completely.
Really interesting. Maya Salovitz, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And that's our program for today. We're here with a new program each week at this hour. Next time My brother, the author and designer Warren Lehrer, will drop by to tell us about the extraordinary life of the prolific novelist Blue Mobley, who, by the way, does not exist. And do tune into my daily radio show, weekdays 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow, the causes of World War I revisited in this 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the horrific Great War. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.